The candle never went out in Paris. It only flickered in silence, waiting for the blade to fall. Tonight, we will live a life in the haunting corridors of the French Revolution. Thrones crumbled, voices rose, and bells tolled, not for prayer, but for the end of kings. Streets once paved with silk echoed with footsteps of the forgotten, while parchment and blood carried the same weight. This is not history as you were taught, but a memory buried in stone and silence, waiting to be touched again. But before we begin this journey, don't forget to subscribe this channel and comment name of your hometown. Leave your whispers in the comments, and if this story speaks to you, light a candle with a like. Now, get comfortable. The past is waiting. They say that history is written in ink, but in the year 1789 it was written in the trembling pulse of Paris, in the echo of footsteps along corridors that once belonged to kings and now trembled beneath the weight of their own. Unraveling, the French Revolution did not begin with fire, nor with steel, but with silence. The kind of silence that clings to the air like frost on a window pane, fragile yet unrelenting. France was a kingdom of contradictions, of golden halls, glittering with chandeliers, while the streets outside were lined with hunger and dust. Palaces smelled of perfume and wax, yet the villages reeked of empty harvests, of bread that was too scarce, of hunger gnawing like a silent army inside the bellies of those who tilled the land. A murmur began, first in whispers between neighbors, then in pamphlets passed from trembling hand to trembling hand, words like liberty and equality written as though they were prayers instead of politics. It is here, in this fragile seam between silence and storm, that the corridors of history began to shift. Versailles, once a theatre of splendor, became a stage of shadows, its mirrors reflecting not just light but also fear that the old order was cracking like a pane of glass struck by frost. The king sat in his chamber, a man burdened by centuries of tradition, unaware that the stones beneath his palace already trembled with the footsteps of change. In the markets of Paris, women clutched baskets with nothing to fill them, their voices rising not in anger at first, but in pleading, the universal cry of mothers who cannot feed their children. The corridors of power heard them faintly, yet dismissed them as noise, until noise became thunder. The air was thick with contradictions, sermons in cathedrals promising eternal life, while the living staggered through hunger and despair. Even the bells of Notre Dame, sacred and steady, seemed to toll with a strange dissonance, as though they sensed that the kingdom's heartbeat faltered. Memory lingers in such places. It clings to dust, to stone, to candlelight that flickers against cracked walls, and if one listens closely, it still whispers of those days when the revolution was not yet a storm but a gathering cloud. There is something haunting in the way silence can carry so much weight, how an empty loaf of bread can carry the weight of a crown, how a drop of ink on parchment can outweigh a soldier's blade. To live in that moment was to feel as though one stood at the edge of a dream where the dreamer does not know whether they are waking or falling deeper into sleep. The revolution began not with violence, but with a trembling in the soul of a people who had been forgotten by their own rulers. A people who walked through corridors of stone that smelled of damp earth and candle smoke, whose shadows were longer than their lifetimes, and whose prayers to heaven seemed to dissolve against ceilings gilded in gold. Each corridor of the kingdom carried an echo. Each echo became a question, and each question became a weapon. Who is the king to us if he cannot feed us? What is faith to us if our children starve? What is silence worth when the air itself tastes of injustice? These questions rang not in speeches or proclamations, but in the hushed tones of fathers returning home empty-handed, in the tears of mothers who carried nothing in their baskets, in the weary eyes of children who had forgotten the taste of bread. That was the haunting beginning, not with the roar of cannon fire, but with the stillness of hunger, the sacred unrest of the forgotten, the quiet truth that kingdoms fall not when swords strike, but when silence grows too heavy to bear. And so the corridors of the French Revolution opened, narrow at first, a crack in the stone of centuries, but soon widening until all of France found itself walking through them, carrying torches, carrying banners, carrying grief turned into a kind of sacred fire. Paris did not awaken all at once. It stirred like a restless sleeper, one eyelid flickering before the body shudders into movement. And in the spring of 1789, the first movements were not of soldiers or cannons, but of pens scratching across parchment, of voices that had long been silenced, daring to name themselves in assembly. The Estates General was summoned, a gathering that had not been called in generations, and with its summoning came the unraveling of a kingdom's fragile balance. The corridors of Versailles filled with men in black robes and white collars, their faces pale beneath the weight of expectation, while nobles glittered in silks and clergy carried the air of ancient authority. Yet beneath the formalities lay a fracture for the Third Estate. Those who carried the burdens of the nation entered not as guests but as shadows demanding to be seen. They were many. They were the forgotten heartbeat of the land, and when the king hesitated, when the old order sought to bind them back into silence, they declared themselves the National Assembly, an act both simple and seismic, like a single candle lit in the deepest vault of darkness. In that moment, the corridors of history bent, for a people declared that sovereignty belonged not to the crown but to the nation, and their words were not ink but flame. Outside Versailles, Paris breathed uneasily, for hunger remained, and words alone did not fill bellies. Yet there was a new pulse in the air, the pulse of possibility. The storm was gathering, not yet thunder, but a charge in the silence, as if the very stones of Paris quivered in anticipation. It is said that in those days, the city itself seemed alive, the Seine flowing like a vein of memory, the bells of Notre Dame echoing both hope and dread, the narrow alleys filled with murmurs that felt like prayers whispered into cracks of a cathedral wall. In taverns, men spoke of liberty with trembling voices, as though uttering the name of a forbidden saint, while in marketplaces, women sharpened not swords but their resolve, knowing that change must be more than words on parchment. The corridors of Versailles watched uneasily, mirrors reflecting more than faces, reflecting the shiver of a world that knew its silence was ending. The king, hesitant, uncertain, became a symbol not of authority but of indecision, and in his hesitation the people found their strength. For every pause from his lips was answered by 1,000 voices rising in the streets. The Bastille stood, a fortress of stone, its towers thick with the scent of damp iron and forgotten cries. And though few prisoners remained within, it was no longer a prison but a symbol, the very embodiment of tyranny. On the 14th of July, the city surged, not with the discipline of an army, but with the desperation of a people who could no longer bear chains. The crowd was vast, not generals, but bakers, cobblers, children, carrying whatever could be lifted as weapons. Their footsteps, like a drumbeat that shook the very marrow of the city. When the gates were stormed, when the fortress fell, it was not merely walls that crumbled, but centuries of fear. Dust rose from broken stones, banners of liberty unfurled in smoke, and Paris itself seemed to exhale as though a weight had been lifted from its chest. The corridors of France echoed with a new sound, the roar of a people who had discovered their own voice, a sound that carried not just across streets, but across centuries, still trembling in memory. The king heard it in Versailles, a distant thunder, and though he sought to dismiss it, he knew that something sacred had shifted. The revolution was no longer a murmur, no longer a crack in silence, but a storm that could not be contained. Yet storms do not only cleanse, they also destroy, and within that roar already lingered the shadow of sorrow. The knowledge that what was broken would not be mended easily, that liberty carried with it both hope and the scent of blood. The haunting corridors had widened, and France walked deeper within them, carrying both torches of light and shadows that would not easily be banished. In those corridors, silence was no longer possible, and the echo of July the 14th would forever mark the beginning of an age where the people themselves became the keepers of destiny. The Bastille had fallen, but what falls in stone must rise in spirit. And in the weeks that followed, Paris breathed as though the city itself had been reborn, trembling between fear and exhilaration. The fortress, once immovable, was dismantled. Stone by stone, its fragments carried away as relics. Pieces of tyranny broken into dust and memory, yet the air was still heavy with uncertainty. For a people who had learned to break chains now had to learn what freedom meant. Across the countryside, whispers turned to flames. The Great Fear, they called it, a tide of panic sweeping through fields and villages. Peasants clutching pitchforks and torches as rumors spread like smoke that nobles plotted revenge, that mercenaries would descend upon them, that shadows of tyranny still lurked just beyond the hedge. Castles that had stood for centuries were stormed, archives of feudal dues torn apart and cast into fire, the very parchment that bound peasant to lord crumbling into ash, as though history itself could be unbound by flame. In Paris, the National Assembly struggled beneath the weight of voices, men speaking of rights, of laws, of a new order, their words soaring like hymns, yet grounded in the dust of hunger that still lingered in the streets. On the night of August the 4th, in a session that stretched into dawn, noblemen rose one by one, some with trembling conviction, others with reluctant voices, and cast aside privileges that had once been as immovable as stone, announcing the death of feudalism as though striking a bell that had long been silent. The corridors of France shook with that declaration, yet outside the assembly, farmers still sowed in hunger. Mothers still prayed over empty baskets, and the promise of liberty felt both radiant and fragile, like a candle flickering in a storm. Then came October, when the women of Paris, weary of waiting, weary of hunger, weary of their children's cries, rose in a tide more powerful than armies. They marched, thousands of them, from market stalls and narrow alleys, carrying not only weapons but the weight of desperation, their footsteps echoing like drums upon the cobblestones, a procession of grief and fire heading toward Versailles. Rain fell upon them, yet did not slow them. Hunger burned within them, yet gave them strength. And when they reached the palace, their cries were not of politics, but of bread, of survival, of justice. Versailles, the symbol of unreachable splendor, became a prison of its own, its golden halls invaded by the cries of those it had forgotten. The king and queen, once distant figures seen only in portraits and ceremonies, now stood before the people, flesh and blood, vulnerable, trembling beneath the gaze of those who demanded bread and justice. The royal family was escorted back to Paris, not as rulers but as captives, their carriage surrounded by the voices of women who had carried history on their shoulders that day. The corridors of power shifted again. No longer gilded halls, but the streets of Paris themselves. No longer distant decrees, but the immediate pulse of the crowd. To walk in those days was to feel history unfold, not as a story told later, but as a storm lived in the present, each step heavy with both terror and transcendence. Paris itself became the heart of the revolution. Its narrow streets filled with pamphlets, with sermons of liberty, with whispers that freedom had been touched, though its form was still unclear. The king lingered in the Tuileries, surrounded, not by loyal courtiers, but by the watchful eyes of his people. A monarch reduced to shadow, a crown that no longer gleamed but seemed heavy with dread. The city's air thickened with both incense and smoke, prayers rising from cathedrals even as fear of betrayal hung in every corner. And through it all one could feel the strange duality of revolution, the way it carried both the scent of roses and the bitterness of ash. For the revolution was no longer a question of hunger alone, nor of symbols like the Bastille. It had become something deeper, something haunting, a reckoning with centuries of memory, as though the very stones of Paris had risen to demand their own freedom. And in that reckoning, shadows gathered, shadows that promised both liberation and sorrow. For what is freedom without unity? What is liberty when drenched in blood? What is equality when the corridors themselves whisper with fear? The people had spoken, and the monarchy trembled. But the path ahead stretched like a corridor of endless doors, each leading into both hope and ruin, and no one yet knew which would be opened. The revolution had seized its breath, yet in the years that followed it began to exhale with a sharper wind. For what began as a demand for bread and dignity now demanded transformation of an entire world. The king remained in Paris, not a ruler upon a throne, but a shadow under watch, a man whose every gesture was weighed against centuries of injustice, whose crown gleamed less like gold and more like a burden chained to his head. The Tuileries became his prison, its corridors echoing with whispers not of splendor but of suspicion. For outside its walls, Paris grew restless, and the revolution that had once been a tide of hope now fractured into countless currents. In the assemblymen debated furiously, voices rising with visions of constitutions, of rights written upon parchment as though they were sacred scripture. Yet beneath their words smoldered suspicion, factions forming like cracks in marble, Jacobin and Girondins, moderates and radicals, each claiming to carry the true heartbeat of liberty. In taverns and clubs, the language of the revolution grew sharper. Newspapers dripped with fire, pamphlets poured into the streets, and the people who had once whispered in hunger now shouted with conviction, their voices swelling into something that resembled both prayer and storm. Beyond France's borders, monarchs trembled, for the fire of Paris threatened to spread, and armies gathered like thunderclouds, Austria and Prussia eyeing the revolution as a contagion that must be crushed before it consumed Europe. Within Paris itself, hunger still lingered, fear still haunted, yet there was also pride, for the people had dragged their monarch into their city, had watched noble privileges fall, had seen symbols of tyranny crumble, and they now believed themselves guardians of a sacred transformation. But sacred transformations are rarely gentle, and shadows lengthened within those corridors. In June of 1791, the king sought to flee, a desperate flight cloaked in disguise. A carriage rattling through the night, carrying the fragile hopes of restoration, but the attempt faltered. And at Varennes the king was recognized, seized, and dragged back not as a sovereign, but as a prisoner of his own people. The image of monarchy shattered further, for how could a king who fled remain the father of his nation? Paris received him not with reverence, but with silence heavy as stone, and in that silence monarchy itself seemed to crumble. The revolution grew harder, its breath colder, its pulse sharper, and by 1792 France declared itself at war with the crowned heads of Europe. Soldiers marched not beneath banners of a king but of a nation, the tricolour fluttering against foreign skies. And with each battle, the revolution became not only internal but universal, a cry against all thrones. Yet war also brought fear of betrayal, fear of conspiracies, fear that the revolution might be strangled by enemies both within and beyond. Paris seethed, the air thick with suspicion, churches stripped of relics, bells silenced or remade into cannon, priests hunted as shadows of tyranny, while new rituals of reason and liberty sought to replace the old. It was an age of rebirth, and an age of ruin, where festivals of freedom filled the streets with colour, even as prisons swelled with those accused of betrayal. The monarchy, fragile and trembling, staggered toward its end. And in August of 1792, the Tuileries fell beneath the fury of the people. Its corridors drenched, not in incense, but in blood, its walls trembling with the roar of a crowd that would no longer accept a crown. The king, once untouchable, was stripped of his title, reduced to citizen, and carried into captivity. France was no longer a kingdom, it was a republic born in fire. And yet the haunting truth lingered, that birth in fire often carries shadows too heavy to bear. The revolution had walked deeper into its own corridors, the walls now lined with both banners and chains, liberty proclaimed loudly, yet whispers of fear and vengeance already circling like ravens above the city. For once liberty has been tasted, it cannot be untasted, and once blood has been spilled, it cannot. The crown had fallen from the king's head long before the blade touched his neck. Yet in January of 1793, the revolution demanded not just the death of monarchy, but the death of the man who embodied it. And so Louis stood before his people no longer as sovereign, but as accused. His trial unfolding like a ritual in which the centuries themselves were summoned to witness. The assembly debated, voices rising like the toll of bells, some trembling with mercy, others burning with vengeance, until the verdict echoed through the chamber, guilty. Guilty not only of betrayal, but of being king in an age that no longer believed in kings. On the morning of his execution, Paris was hushed, the streets thick with frost and silence. Thousands gathering not to see a battle, but to see an ending, the air sharp as knives, the sky grey with anticipation. The guillotine stood upon the Place de la Révolution, its wooden frame looming like an altar, its blade glinting with cold inevitability. Louis ascended the scaffold with measured steps, a man whose body was mortal, yet whose presence still carried the shadows of thrones and palaces. And when the blade fell, it was not only his life that ended, but a chapter of history itself. The crowd exhaled as one, some in mourning, some in exultation, the silence breaking into cries of Vive la République. And the city seemed to shudder as though it had crossed a threshold from which it could never return. The king was gone, the monarchy dissolved, but in his absence a new weight descended. For liberty won by blood demands more blood, and suspicion grows faster than roses. The revolution, once a hymn of unity, fractured further, voices sharpening into accusations. Neighbors watching neighbors. The corridors of Paris filled not with whispers of hope, but with the rustle of fear. The guillotine, once a singular spectacle, became a rhythm, its blade rising and falling like the pendulum of a clock that measured time not in hours, but in lives. Danton spoke of audacity, Marat of vigilance, Robespierre of virtue, and their words echoed like scripture through the clubs and assemblies. Yet beneath their syllables lingered the scent of iron and the knowledge that each who preached could one day stand upon the scaffold themselves. The revolution was now a republic of suspicion, its sacred flame burning so brightly that it threatened to consume all who stood too near. Beyond Paris, the wars deepened, the borders aflame, the republic besieged on every side, and within, uprisings flared, the Vendée rising in grief and defiance, cities trembling under the weight of civil strife. To walk in Paris was to feel the duality of dawn and night, to see festivals of liberty with banners and flowers one day, and processions of prisoners bound for execution the next. The corridors of power grew narrower, each door closing, each window shuttering, until the revolution itself seemed imprisoned by the very fear it had unleashed. Yet even within this darkness there lingered a haunting beauty, for the ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity glowed still like candles in the storm. Fragile yet unextinguished, their light flickering against the shadows of terror. France had stepped irrevocably into the fire, and though the king's voice was silenced, his absence spoke louder than his rule had ever done. A silence that echoed through palaces now abandoned, through streets lined with banners, through cathedrals stripped of altars, through every trembling heartbeat of a people who had killed their king and now wondered what ghosts they had awakened. The revolution walked deeper into its own corridors, and each step rang with both triumph and dread, each footfall leaving behind not only the dust of the old world, but also the blood of the new. Paris, 1793. The revolution had crossed its threshold. What began as a storm of ideals had turned into a tempest of suspicion. The guillotine no longer stood as a symbol of justice, but as the cold shadow of fear stretching across the city. Its blade was sharp, unmerciful, and hungry. Crowds gathered daily at the Place de la Révolution as if attending a grim theatre. Vendors sold roasted chestnuts, pamphlets, and tricolour ribbons, while mothers brought their children to witness what they called the people's justice. The square smelled of smoke, iron, and blood. Each thud of the falling blade was met with cheers, as though the revolution had become a carnival of death. Among those who stood closest to the guillotine were the sans-culottes working poor, dressed in plain trousers instead of aristocratic breeches. For them, each execution was more than punishment. It was a promise that the world which had oppressed them for centuries was finally being overturned. And yet, in the quiet corners of Paris, even the sans-culottes whispered in unease, how many heads must fall before the people themselves feel safe? The guillotine did not discriminate. Once the heads of nobles rolled into the wicker baskets, it turned toward priests, scholars, merchants, and finally, its own architects. The revolution, like Saturn of myth, began to devour its own children. Inside the halls of the Committee of Public Safety. Tension was thick as candle wax, dripping. On oak tables, Maximilien Robespierre's voice, sharp and unwavering, declared, virtue, without terror, is powerless. He saw himself as the guardian of purity, the incorruptible sentinel of the revolution. But his virtue had grown claws. To protect liberty, he believed, one must crush all whispers of treason. And in a city where hunger gnawed at stomachs, where every darkened doorway might hide a plot, suspicion spread like wildfire. Danton, once his ally, urged moderation. The revolution devours itself, Maximilien. Mercy will save it, not fear. Asterisk, but Robespierre's eyes burned with a conviction that left no room for mercy. Mercy is betrayal, he replied. To pardon traitors is to betray the Republic. Asterisk, thus, former comrades became enemies, and the guillotine became the final judge. Asterisk, among the condemned was Marie Antoinette, the queen once adored and despised in equal measure. She had walked Versailles as though born of another world, her gowns heavy with pearls, her words light with indifference. But in October 1793, she mounted the scaffold not as a queen, but as a widow, stripped of jewels, stripped of crown, stripped even of dignity. Asterisk, her hair had been cut short, her dress plain white, her face gaunt but calm. As she stumbled while ascending the platform, she whispered to the executioner, Asterisk, pardon me, sir. I did not mean to do it. Asterisk, her words, fragile yet human, fell upon ears deafened by chants of Vive la République. Asterisk, when the blade fell, silence followed a silence, more haunting than applause. Even the crowd felt the weight of finality. The old world was gone, and there was no turning back. Asterisk, but the revolution did not stop with a queen. Writers like Olympe de Gouges, who had dared demand equal rights for women, found themselves beneath the blade. Priests loyal to the Pope, Girondins, who opposed Parisian radicals, moderates who pleaded for clemency, all marched in procession toward death. Asterisk, each morning, carts rattled through cobblestone streets carrying prisoners. From their wooden frames, men and women waved, sang, prayed, or wept. Some wrote last letters with trembling hands. Others, too weary for words, closed their eyes and let the rumble of wheels carry them to destiny. Asterisk, the guillotine became not just an instrument, but a rhythm of life, its daily toll shaping the heartbeat of the revolution. Asterisk, and yet, amid the carnage, Paris pulsed with contradictions. Theatres remained open, cafes bustled with arguments, pamphleteers scribbled furiously by candlelight. Fashion itself bent to the revolution. Women wore robes, a la citoyenne, plain dresses of linen or cotton, while men sported tricolor cockades pinned proudly to their hats. Even leisure became political. To wear silk or powdered wigs was to invite suspicion. Asterisk, it was a city at once alive and dying, free and imprisoned, jubilant and terrified. Asterisk, by 1794, whispers filled taverns and salons. How long could this continue? How long before every citizen became suspect? Asterisk, Robespierre, once celebrated as the voice of incorruptible virtue, now seemed an untouchable tyrant cloaked in righteousness. He declared that he alone knew the will of the people, that he alone could preserve the Republic. And yet, the more he tightened his grip, the more his comrades felt the noose draw near. Asterisk, Paris trembled not under kings anymore, but under the shadow of its own revolution. The year was 1793, and Paris had grown accustomed to the thud of the blade. Each morning, as dew clung to the cobblestones, the carts rolled once more through narrow streets, carrying men and women toward the square where silence awaited them. For silence had become the true ruler of France. Not liberty, not fraternity, not even terror. Silence. The silence of empty chairs in Parliament, of vacant windows in noble estates, of families who dared not whisper a name at supper. Yet the city itself did not fall quiet. Paris hummed with rumor, with the creak of doors, with the scratch of pens writing anonymous denunciations. Every word was dangerous. A glance too long, a smile at the wrong neighbor. The absence of enthusiasm during a festival was enough, and so silence was practiced as a shield. But it betrayed itself in every breath. The revolution had eaten the monarchy, and then its priests. Now it turned inward to devour its own children. Danton, once a lion whose voice shook taverns and halls alike, found his roar diminished. He had called for blood once, but when rivers began to overflow, he grew weary. Enough, he whispered to his allies. France cannot live forever in execution. Yet in those words lay his death. Robespierre heard them not as mercy, but as treason. And so Danton was summoned. Paris gathered at the trial, though the outcome was never in doubt. He stood tall, mocking his judges, laughing at the farce of law. "They will show my head to the people," he sneered. "It will be worth watching." And when the blade kissed his throat, his prophecy was truth. The crowd craned forward, not in horror, but in hunger. They had grown addicted to endings. After Danton, Desmoulins followed. His pen, once aflame with revolutionary fire, had cooled into pleas for clemency. "We must learn mercy," he wrote, "or we shall find ourselves surrounded only by graves." The paper was confiscated, burned, his words deemed counter-revolutionary. The man who had summoned Paris to the storming of the Bastille now walked the same road as the king he dethroned. His wife, Lucille, screamed his name as he was taken. Days later, she too was led to the scaffold. Her crime, love, and loyalty. The silence deepened. Robespierre stood at the height of his power. He was called the Incorruptible, a man who dressed in plain clothes, who spoke with the cadence of a priest, whose eyes never seemed to blink. He declared virtue the lifeblood of the Republic, and terror its guardian. To oppose him was to oppose France itself. He signed names not with ink, but with death. Each evening, the lists grew longer, and Paris awoke to fewer faces. But silence is a fragile master. In the clubs and committees, murmurs began. Why did Robespierre never falter? Why did he wield such moral certainty when others trembled? Was he France's savior or her tyrant? Even his allies watched him with unease. Saint Just, young and severe, stood by him like a shadow. "We must not merely punish traitors," Saint Just declared. "We must punish the indifferent." And with that, the revolution outlawed silence itself. Fear now reigned supreme. A sigh, a hesitation, an unreadable glance could condemn. Families avoided even eye contact at their tables. Children were taught to report their parents. It was no longer enough to be innocent. One had to be fervent. To smile too little at the festival of the Supreme Being was to risk accusation. To clap too late at a speech was to invite suspicion. And yet, the streets grew emptier of joy. Where once flags had been raised in triumph, now banners drooped under the weight of blood. Theaters closed, laughter waned. Even the guillotine lost its novelty. Parisians stopped counting. They no longer asked who had fallen, for it could be anyone. It could be everyone. The revolution had promised a new dawn, but the sun seemed trapped behind a perpetual eclipse. Silence spread like frost over a field, killing not with noise but with absence. The French people, who had once sung in the squares, now whispered only in their hearts. But silence breeds resistance. In the clubs, whispers turned to grumbles, grumbles to plans. Some asked if the Incorruptible could not be questioned. Was he not a king in disguise? And if France had killed one king, could she not kill another? Robespierre could feel it, though he denied it. His speeches grew longer, sharper, desperate. He spoke not as a man, but as a prophet cornered by shadows. "We are not yet safe," he cried. "The Republic is in danger." But each word betrayed the truth. It was he who was in danger, for silence no longer protected him. Paris had grown used to the sound of carts rattling across cobblestones, carrying men and women to their deaths. What once shocked now became routine. The guillotine stood not merely as an instrument of justice, but as a daily spectacle, a theatre where the audience was the city itself. Bread remained scarce, suspicion abundant, and the revolution, once a beacon of liberty, now cast shadows longer than its promises. In the corridors of the Committee of Public Safety, Robespierre's voice was measured, precise, almost religious. In its cadence, he spoke of virtue, of purity, of the Republic's need for unwavering devotion. But in his eyes burned the quiet certainty of a man who believed himself chosen, a prophet cloaked not in silk but in blood. Each decree carried not just the weight of law, but of destiny. And yet, even destiny had its fractures. Whispers began to thread through the air. Robespierre was becoming too powerful, too austere, too dangerous. The prisons overflowed with those branded as traitors, though their only crime might have been a careless word, a forgotten loyalty, or simply wealth itself. Aristocrats, priests, and peasants alike none were immune. In dank cells, they clutched letters to family, whispered prayers to gods they hoped still listened, and waited for dawn's heavy tread. Outside, the citizens cheered and jeered, hungry for bread, for justice, for something they could not name. Amid this fever, dissent brewed not only in the streets, but within the revolution itself. Danton, once a roaring lion of the people, dared to speak of mercy, of halting the executions that stained the Republic's soul. "Enough blood," he cried. "Let us stop before the revolution devours itself." But mercy was a luxury, and the guillotine knew no rest. Robespierre saw hesitation, not as humanity, but as betrayal. Danton and his allies mounted the scaffold, silenced beneath the blade they had once helped to raise. Each execution seemed to draw the revolution tighter, as if a bowstring stretched beyond its limit. Fear ruled more completely than any king had. The people, who had risen against tyranny, now bowed beneath a new kind, the tyranny of suspicion. In cafes, men lowered their voices. In markets, women weighed each phrase. Even silence became dangerous, for it could be mistaken for disloyalty. But even Robespierre could not escape the shadows he cast. His speeches grew darker, his eyes more hollow. To his enemies, he seemed less a leader than a priest of death, demanding sacrifice for an abstract god. At last, the tide turned. The very men who once cheered his vision now feared it. In July of 1794, in the month the revolution renamed Thermidor, the hall of the convention erupted in fury. "Down with the tyrant," voices cried. Robespierre, stunned, tried to answer, but his words drowned in a sea of rage. Arrested, wounded, dragged before the tribunal he once controlled, Robespierre became the very figure he had condemned countless times before. His end came swiftly, the guillotine blade falling with almost poetic symmetry. Paris, which had cheered his rise, now roared at his fall. Yet his death did not erase the scars. The terror had seeped too deeply into the marrow of France. Trust had been fractured, innocence buried, and the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity forever shadowed by the echo of the blade. When silence finally settled over Paris, it was not the silence of peace, but of exhaustion. The revolution had devoured its own children, and in the weary air of Thermidor, A nation stood trembling at the threshold of something new, unsure whether it had escaped tyranny or merely reshaped it. The revolution, once lit like a flame of hope, now burned with the heat of suspicion. Its corridors had grown darker, its whispers sharper, its air colder. Liberty, equality, fraternity, the words that had once stirred hearts were now uttered under breath, weighed down by fear of who might be listening. The guillotine, once the grim symbol of justice against tyrants, had become the relentless instrument of a new terror. The Place de la Revolution reeked of blood. Crowds gathered daily, some with fire in their eyes, others with trembling hands pressed to their chests. What had begun as a tool of deliverance had transformed into a stage for death where monarchs, nobles, priests, and now even revolutionaries themselves met their fate beneath the blade. The machine showed no mercy. It asked no questions, silenced both the guilty and the innocent with the same finality. The great figures of the revolution walked their final steps down this corridor of shadows. King Louis XVI, once robed in majesty, now stood in plain garments, his voice steady yet fragile as he declared his innocence before the blade fell. His blood baptized the revolution, and with it, the old monarchy died. Months later, Queen Marie Antoinette, her hair whitened by captivity and grief, mounted the scaffold. No jewels, no gowns only, a widow's dress and a steady gaze. When the blade descended, the echoes seemed to toll the death knell of an entire era. But the guillotine was insatiable. Danton, once the lion of the revolution, thundered defiantly even in chains, "Do not forget to show my head to the people. It is worth seeing." Robespierre, architect of the terror, who had sent so many to their end, finally met the same steel he once commanded. The corridors of Paris buzzed with disbelief, how swiftly the revolution consumed its own children, and in those same corridors, families whispered the names of the condemned. A knock on the door at midnight meant exile, imprisonment, or worse. The Revolutionary Tribunal moved swiftly, its trials less about justice than about silence, silencing dissent, silencing doubt, silencing any who might question the unyielding march of the revolution's will. Yet, even as the streets ran red, there lingered a strange, haunting beauty. The revolution was not only terror, it was a vision and experiment in human destiny, written in both light and shadow. In the cafes of Paris, men still debated the future of democracy. Pamphlets and posters continued to speak of a new world, one where kings would be replaced by the people themselves. In the whispers of poets, in the courage of women who nursed the wounded, in the resilience of peasants who still dreamed of freedom, the revolution's fire refused to die. The guillotine may have become its cruelest symbol, but even in its shadow, hope endured. From the silence of prisons, letters of love and defiance were smuggled out, written in trembling hands that knew they would never touch sunlight again. Some wrote to children they would never see grow. Some wrote prayers, asking that their sacrifice might one day be remembered not as madness, but as the price of liberty. And so, the revolution marched on, haunted by the very corridors it had built. The sound of footsteps echoed through prisons like the conciergerie where damp walls carried the sighs of the doomed. The streets, once bright with banners, grew accustomed to the thud of carts carrying the condemned. Each day began with the hammer's ring that reset the blade, a rhythm as chilling as church bells tolling for the dead. But in the deepest shadows, another whisper stirred, a whisper that spoke not of death, but of what might yet be born. For revolutions are never only about endings. they are also about beginnings. And even as the terror devoured France, the idea of liberty had already escaped its corridors, traveling beyond borders, beyond guillotines, beyond the reach of any blade. The revolution had devoured itself. What began with cries for liberty had, by its final act, left Paris hollowed, its streets still, its air heavy with ghosts. The guillotine, once the theatre of justice, now stood like a silent monument to both vengeance and despair. Blood no longer dripped upon the cobblestones, yet its stains seemed permanent, etched into the memory of France. Napoleon Bonaparte was rising, a man of calculation and steel, a soldier who sensed destiny in the chaos. Where once the revolution had promised equality, he promised order. The corridors of Versailles, once drenched in silk and laughter, had been abandoned long ago. Now, new corridors of power were being carved in the heart of Paris, narrower, sharper, infused with the scent of ambition. The people, those who had marched with bread in their hands, who had sung the Marseillaise with tears in their eyes, were tired. Their revolution had stretched across a decade of fire, but exhaustion softened even the most fervent voices. The hope that had roared in 1789 was now a whisper, fragile and unsure. Liberty had been won. Yes, but at a cost so great that the survivors struggled to measure it. In hidden corners of Paris, mothers still spoke in hushed tones about sons who had disappeared into prisons. Widows stood at windows, staring toward execution squares that were now empty but somehow still alive with memory. Each gust of wind across the Place de la Révolution seemed to carry phantom cries, the pleading voices of those condemned, the roaring approval of the crowd, the final silence that followed the blade. France had changed forever. No monarch would return to rule in the old way. No courtier would strut through Versailles as if divinely chosen. The revolution had shattered illusions and forced an entire world to see that power could be toppled by hunger, that kings could bleed like common men, that voices once silenced could roar loud enough to shake empires. Yet the corridors it left behind were not just political, they were spiritual, haunted passages of memory that France would carry into every century that followed. In the schools, young children whispered of heroes and martyrs. In taverns, old men argued whether Robespierre was savior or tyrant. In churches, silence lingered, where once bells had tolled for a kingdom now gone. The revolution had not ended, it had only changed form. It lived in the Constitution, in the restless crowds, in the whisper of parchment signed with trembling hands. It lived in the echo of the guillotine, in the ink of pamphlets, in the graves of thousands. It lived in the dream of liberty, battered yet unbroken. And so the corridors of France remained haunted by laughter that had turned to screams, by promises that had turned to ash, by faces that once looked toward the future and found only steel. But through those same corridors, another sound began to rise, not of terror, but of resilience. For history had not ended in 1799. It was only beginning. The revolution's echo traveled far beyond France. Across Europe, monarchs trembled. In the Americas, revolutionaries felt the spark quicken in their veins. In India, in Haiti, in every land where oppression weighed heavy, the story of the French people became a beacon, proof that even the mightiest thrones could fall when the people dared to stand. The haunting corridors of the French Revolution, then, were not corridors of despair alone. They were corridors of warning, corridors of hope, corridors that whispered of humanity's eternal struggle, the hunger for freedom, the danger of excess, the fragile balance between justice and mercy. And so we leave them, these shadowed halls, echoing with both ghosts and songs. A nation had walked through fire and emerged scarred, yes, but alive, still searching, still dreaming. The guillotine was silent, the palaces emptied, but in every heart that still beat beneath the Parisian sky, the revolution had carved its mark. A corridor that no one king, tyrant, or conqueror would ever fully close again. And so, our journey through the haunting corridors of the French Revolution comes to an end. If your soul longs for more passages into history's shadows, take my hand and subscribe, for the past is never truly gone. It merely waits in silence for someone to listen. In our next voyage, we will step into the whispered secrets of Victorian London's midnight streets, another chapter etched into the stones of time. Until then, may the echoes of revolution follow you into your dreams, and may you wake ready for the next legend. Good night.